The year is 1986, October 12th. A calm Sunday evening in Virginia, and two young people are about to become the first victims in what would become one of America's most chilling, unsolved mysteries. 27-year-old Kathleen Thomas and 21-year-old Rebecca Dowski had been out for dinner. Friends, maybe more than friends, they decided to take a drive along one of Virginia's most scenic routes, the Colonial Parkway, a 23-mile stretch of road connecting Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown, designed to be beautiful, peaceful, romantic even, dotted with scenic overlooks and quiet pull-offs where couples could park and enjoy the view. But on this particular night, the Parkway would become something else entirely, a hunting ground. Their white Honda Civic was discovered the next morning at the Cheatham Annex Overlook, about 8 miles east of Williamsburg. The car was found pushed down an embankment, partially hidden from view. Inside, investigators made a discovery that would haunt them for decades. Kathleen and Rebecca were dead, their bodies burned beyond recognition. The killer had set their car ablaze, attempting to destroy any evidence that might lead back to him or her. Because at this point, nobody knew who they were dealing with. Nobody knew that this was just the beginning. Within 3 years, 4 more couples would either disappear or be found murdered along the Colonial Parkway. 8 young people. 5 confirmed dead, 1 missing and presumed dead, 2 who simply vanished without a trace, all of them connected by one thing. They had been on the Parkway, looking for a quiet place to be together, when something went terribly wrong. This is the story of the Colonial Parkway murders, a case that stumped investigators across multiple agencies, spawned countless theories, and to this day remains unsolved. A case where the killer seemed to know exactly how to approach his victims, how to gain their trust, and how to disappear without leaving behind meaningful evidence. Tonight, we're going to walk through each of these crimes, piece together the patterns that emerged, and explore the theory that has dominated this case from the very beginning. The idea that someone was impersonating law enforcement to lure these couples to their deaths. Because when you look at the evidence, when you see how these vehicles were found, how these victims behaved in their final moments, it becomes clear that whoever did this had a method. A way of making people trust them, a way of making them comply. Let's start with the setting. The Colonial Parkway isn't just any road. Completed in 1957, it was designed as a scenic byway, part of the Colonial National Historical Park. No commercial traffic, no billboards, no neon signs. Just trees, history, and quiet overlooks with views of the James and York rivers. For young couples in the 80s, it was perfect. Private enough to be romantic, safe enough that you didn't worry about what might happen. The kind of place where you could park your car, roll down the windows, and just talk. Or maybe do more than talk. But that privacy, that isolation, also made it perfect for someone with darker intentions. The overlooks and pull-offs were scattered along the Parkway, each one offering quick access to the main road. You could approach without being seen, do whatever you came to do, and be back on the highway in minutes. No witnesses, no surveillance cameras. This was 1986 after all, and if you needed people to trust you, to roll down their windows or step out of their cars, well, there was one sure way to make that happen. Flash a badge. The law enforcement impersonation theory didn't emerge immediately. At first, investigators were dealing with what appeared to be an isolated incident, a double homicide with unknown motives. But as more couples were targeted, as patterns began to emerge, it became impossible to ignore the signs. Let's go back to that first crime, Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski. Their car was found with the doors unlocked, windows partially down. No signs of a struggle inside the vehicle, No defensive wounds on the bodies that could be determined given the condition they were found in. It was as if they had willingly gotten out of their car. But why would two women get out of their vehicle at a remote overlook after dark? Why would they trust someone enough to leave the safety of their locked car? Unless that someone had a badge. Unless they believed they were dealing with a police officer conducting a routine check of the area. 7 months later, the theory would gain more weight. April 10th, 1987. Another couple, another crime scene. David Knobling, 20, and Robin Edwards, 14, had been out on their first date. They drove to the Ragged Island Wildlife Management Area, not technically on the Parkway, but close enough to matter. Their bodies were found 3 days later, shot execution style. But here's what investigators found interesting. David's pickup truck was discovered at the nearby boat ramp, but it had been moved. The keys were missing, but the truck showed no signs of forced entry. No broken windows, no damaged locks. Again, it appeared the victims had cooperated with their attacker, had trusted someone enough to go with them willingly. The pattern was becoming clearer, but it was about to get much more disturbing. September 5th, 1987. Cassandra Haley, 18, and Richard Call, 20, disappeared after leaving a party in Newport News. They were supposed to be going for a drive, maybe stopping somewhere along the Parkway. Their car was found the next morning at the York River Overlook. The doors were open, the interior light was on, Richard's wallet was still there with money inside, and Cassandra's purse was on the seat. The keys were in the ignition, but Cassandra and Richard were gone. Despite massive searches involving hundreds of volunteers, bloodhounds, helicopters, and divers, no trace of them has ever been found. They simply vanished. This scene told investigators everything they needed to know about how this killer operated. The car doors were open, not forced. The valuables were left behind, ruling out robbery as a motive. And most tellingly, there were no signs of a violent struggle. It was as if someone had approached their vehicle, convinced them to get out, and then made them disappear. But how do you convince two healthy young people to abandon their car in the middle of the night? How do you get them to trust you enough to go with you willingly? You show them a badge. By now, investigators from multiple agencies were taking notice. The National Park Service, which had jurisdiction over the Parkway itself, the FBI, Virginia State Police, local sheriff's departments. They were all looking at these cases, and they were all coming to the same conclusion. Someone was using the authority of law enforcement to target young couples. Someone who understood how people would react to a traffic stop, who knew that most citizens would comply with police orders without question. The killer was patient, methodical, and worst of all, he was getting away with it. But the investigation was facing serious challenges. The Colonial Parkway fell under federal jurisdiction as part of the National Historical Park, but the crimes were happening across multiple counties and jurisdictions. Evidence was being processed by different labs, theories were being developed by different agencies, and communication between departments was inconsistent at best. This jurisdictional complexity would plague the investigation for years, creating gaps in information sharing that may have allowed crucial leads to slip through the cracks. Meanwhile, the killer wasn't done. The most brutal attack was yet to come. October 12th, 1988, exactly 2 years after the first murders. Anna Maria Phelps, 18, and Daniel Lauer, 21, were found dead in a wooded area about a mile from where their car had been discovered on the Parkway. But this time, the killer had changed his approach. Anna Maria and Daniel hadn't just been shot. They had been brutalized. Anna Maria's throat had been slashed so violently she was nearly decapitated. Daniel had been stabbed multiple times. The level of violence was shocking, suggesting either escalation from the previous crimes or possibly a different perpetrator altogether. Some investigators wondered if they were dealing with multiple killers, or if the original suspect had simply become more vicious over time. Their car was found at a rest area, with the doors open and the emergency flashes on. Once again, no signs of forced entry. No evidence that the victims had tried to fight off their attacker while still in the vehicle. The pattern held. Someone had convinced them to get out of their car. Someone they trusted. The forensic evidence from the Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer scene was more extensive than previous crimes, but it still wasn't enough. The outdoor location, exposure to weather, and the passage of time between the murders and discovery had degraded crucial DNA evidence. This was 1988, remember? No advanced genetic testing. No national DNA databases. No surveillance cameras capturing license plates or facial features. Investigators were working with what they had. Fiber evidence, some footprint impressions, witness accounts of suspicious vehicles in the area, but nothing that definitively pointed to a specific suspect. The killer seemed to understand the limitations of 1980s forensic science, the remote locations, the time delays in discovery, the environmental factors that would compromise evidence. It was almost as if they knew exactly how long they had before the bodies would be found. And then, just as suddenly as the attacks had begun, they stopped. The last confirmed Colonial Parkway murder occurred in 1989. Though investigators debate whether this final case truly fits the pattern. Keith Call, brother of the still-missing Richard Call, and Sandra Haley, sister of the missing Cassandra Haley, were found shot to death near the James River. But the circumstances were different enough that some investigators consider it a separate crime. By 1990, the Colonial Parkway killer had seemingly vanished. No more couples were targeted along the Parkway. No more staged vehicle scenes. No more disappearances. But the investigation continued. Task forces were formed and reformed. Evidence was reviewed and re-reviewed. New technologies were applied to old samples as they became available. In the 1990s, DNA testing advanced enough to extract profiles from some of the preserved evidence. But there were no matches in the databases. Whoever had committed these crimes had never been arrested for a serious felony, or they simply weren't in the system. The law enforcement impersonation theory remained the leading explanation, but it raised troubling questions. Was the killer actually a police officer? Someone with access to legitimate badges and patrol vehicles? Or was it someone impersonating law enforcement, using fake badges and unmarked cars to fool victims? Both possibilities were terrifying in their own way. If the killer was a real police officer, it meant someone sworn to protect and serve had used that authority to hunt and murder innocent people. If it was an impersonator, it meant someone had studied police procedures well enough to convincingly portray law enforcement in the most crucial moments. Investigators interviewed hundreds of police officers, security guards, and anyone else with potential access to badges or patrol vehicles. They looked into officers who had worked the areas during the relevant time periods, who had access to the crime scenes, who might have inside knowledge of the investigations. Nothing stuck. No solid suspects emerged. The case began to fade from headlines, but it never disappeared entirely. Families of the victims kept the pressure on. Cold case units periodically reviewed the evidence. Documentary filmmakers and true crime writers kept the story alive in public consciousness. Then came the genetic genealogy revolution. In recent years, the same techniques used to solve cases like the Golden State Killer have been applied to the Colonial Parkway evidence. Touch DNA, mitochondrial DNA analysis, genetic genealogy, searches through public databases. These tools that didn't exist in the 1980s might finally provide the breakthrough investigators have been seeking for over 30 years. In 2021, the FBI announced they were conducting new DNA testing on evidence from the Colonial Parkway cases. They're working with Virginia State Police and other agencies to apply cutting-edge forensic techniques to samples that have been preserved since the original crimes. There's also renewed focus on witness accounts and suspect descriptions from the time period. People who might have been too scared to come forward in the 1980s, or who didn't realize the significance of what they saw. Long-haul truckers, shift workers, anyone who regularly traveled the Parkway during the relevant time periods. Modern investigative techniques allow for more sophisticated analysis of cell phone records, financial transactions, and travel patterns. If the killer is still alive, if they left any digital footprint in recent decades, there might be ways to trace it back to the crimes. But time is working against the investigation too. Potential witnesses are aging or dying. Evidence continues to degrade despite best preservation efforts. And if the killer was already an adult in the 1980s, they might no longer be alive to face justice. Still, the families refuse to give up hope. The investigators refuse to let the cases go cold, because somewhere out there, someone knows what happened during those terrifying years along the Colonial Parkway. Maybe it's someone who suspected a family member, a co-worker, a neighbor. Maybe it's someone who saw something suspicious but never reported it. Maybe it's someone who has lived with guilt and fear for over 30 years, finally ready to tell the truth. The Colonial Parkway murders represent more than just unsolved crimes. They represent a fundamental violation of trust, a corruption of the very authority meant to protect us. They show us how vulnerable we all are when someone decides to exploit the systems we depend on for safety. Tonight, as you drive past a scenic overlook or pull off on a quiet road, remember Kathleen and Rebecca, David and Robin, Cassandra and Richard, Anna Maria and Daniel. Remember that their killer was never caught. Their families never received full justice. The Colonial Parkway is still beautiful, still peaceful, still romantic. But for those who remember these crimes, it will always carry the shadow of what happened there. A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one wearing a badge, the one we're taught to trust without question. The investigation continues. The hope for answers remains. And somewhere in a laboratory or database, the evidence that could finally solve the Colonial Parkway murders might be waiting for the right technology, the right investigator, the right moment to reveal its secrets. Until then, the Parkway keeps its silence, and 8 young people wait for justice.